development in March. And our language professor, Luana Lamberti, would like to say something about the study trip to Porto Alegre that we're organizing for this coming summer. Thanks, Luana.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, I just would like to talk a little bit about our new study abroad program in Porto Alegre. Some of you probably already know and already have applied, but for those who would be interested, we're gonna go this summer in May. The trip dates are between May 5th and June 2nd, so it's spend a whole month in Porto Alegre. We're going to actually have an info session next week on Tuesday, February 7th at 4 p.m. So if you're interested, you can talk to me. My name is Luana Lamberti, and I'm in the Modern Languages Department. And you can come to the info session, and then we're going to give you guys more details about the study abroad. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Luana. So as we're all aware, the elections in October were the closest elections since redemocratization in Brazil. They were followed by protests in various parts of the country and the attacks on the Planalto on the 8th of January. And so I think it's a sort of an urgent question of sort of how the government's going to confront all the challenges that it has. And I wanted to say a little bit of something about all three of the panelists before we begin with Matias. So to my right, Matias Spektor is a professor of international relations at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo. He's the creator of a new school there of international relations. He has a DPhil from the University of Oxford. And amongst his many publications, my favorite book of his is Kissinger and Brazil, which is a study of the relationship between Brazil and the US during the Nixon administration in the US and the Medici administration in Brazil. I highly recommend Kissinger and Brazil, but he's author of many other works. He's currently a visitor at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Our second panelist will be Angela Alonso, joining us on Zoom. She's a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Sao Paulo, the president of the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, SEBRAP, and she has a PhD in sociology from USP, and her most recent book is, I highly recommend this book, The Last Abolition, the Brazilian Anti-Slavery Movement, 1868-1888, applies sociological theory of social movements to very rich archival work to reveal fresh information about the abolition movement. And our last but not least, our third panelist is Sergio Fausto, also on Zoom. He's the executive director of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation and the co-director of the Democratic Platform Project and the State of Democracy in Americas project. He's a political scientist who writes occasionally for POE. It's probably the best monthly magazine for politics and other issues in Brazil. And amongst Sergio's publications are A Concise History of Brazil, co-written with his father, Boris Fausto. And Sergio was also an advisor to the Brazilian Treasury from 1995 to 2002. So without dwelling on any other issues that we could speculate on, I wanted to turn it over to Matias for his thoughts on the challenges of the new government in Brazil. Thanks, Matias.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. It's a real treat to be here. So thanks for the invitation. Tony asked me an impossible question, which is, what are the challenges facing Lula now? So let me give you my take. Brazil transitioned away from autocracy to civilian rule 40 years ago. And if we look at these 40 years, at the quality of democracy during these 40 years, what we see is, if you follow the VDEM index, is one of the indices that looks at the quality of democracy, you see Brazil starting very low in 1985, when the generals go back to the barracks and a civilian president takes over. And it goes up very, very slowly, painfully slowly. And it peaks around 2011. And around 2015, something happens and it begins to decline. And it begins to decline before the arrival of Bolsonaro. And as it declines, the decline engenders Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is not the cause of democratic backsliding, I think. He is a symptom of democratic backsliding. And when he takes over, the index begins to fall very dramatically. And today, Brazil is halfway through where it was in 2015. So the context for chat is the fifth largest democracy in the world is experiencing a process of democratic backsliding. And we need to understand what the hell is going on. Here's my answer, and then I'll be fascinated to hear my colleagues on Zoom to see whether they agree with this analysis or not. The one thing that turned Brazil, that really shook the political system to its foundations, is a massive corruption scandal that broke in 2014. In 2014, the Brazilian voter found out how it is the Brazilian president actually form a governing majority. And the problem is Brazil has this very strange political system. It's got many, many parties in parliament. Over 20 parties have representation in parliament. And the electoral process that selects members of Congress is completely divorced from the electoral process that leads to choosing a president. The president gets elected on a majoritarian election, 50% plus one. The members of Congress, they get elected on an open list, proportional system with party coalitions. Very messy, so messy that voters know who they vote for, but they do not know who they actually elect, because votes get redistributed within these coalitions. So the same voter picks a president, votes for members of Congress without knowing who they elect, and oftentimes candidates for Congress have no commitment to the programmatic agenda of the president. But now the president needs to form a coalition in Congress in order to govern. Because there are so many parties, and the threshold for you to get elected is so low, in order to govern, the president needs to bring into his coalition parties that have nothing to do with the president ideologically, programmatically. So you have presidents on the left building up coalitions with parties on the right. You have presidents of the right needing the votes of members of Congress in the left. So what do Brazilian presidents do? These we knew. They put together a cabinet and they distribute the cabinet according to the number of members of Congress that they have in their base. So if they have 10 parties in the base, they need to split up the cabinet among the 10 different parties. And they distribute budgets according to congressional representation for each one of the parties. What we didn't know, but then we found out in 2014, is that that's not enough. The president also needs to help parties in the base pay for their campaigns. And the method that successive administrations in Brazil found out to find that money was through an illicit trick. Basically, the administration asks for big infrastructure work, commissions big infrastructure work, it overpays for the services, and the private conglomerates that do the infrastructure work under the table give back some of the money to the president. And we found out that the president, and this is not just President Lula, this was the dominant way of organizing Brazilian politics. The only reason we didn't find out about this before was that before the watchdog institutions were much weaker than they were in 2014. What we find out in 2014 is that the president is the chief fundraiser illegally for parties in the base, and shock and shock, this is typical Brazil, he's also a fundraiser for some of the parties that are not in the base, even parties on the opposition. So the minute the voter finds out about this, and we're talking about billions of dollars in a country where around 50% of the population is poor, according to the World Bank, where infant mortality is absolutely shocking, where 100 million people, half Brazilians, have no access to sanitation at home, the voter suddenly realizes that they're getting rigged. And the political system implodes. There's the impeachment of a president on circumstances that are absolutely questionable. The sitting government at the time was a government of the left, so you open a political market for the extreme right to say that the left are crooks, even if the evidence suggests that the right are crooks as well. And from that moment on, this dynamic emerges in Brazil, centered around populism 101. Populism is an ideology which says that there is a virtuous people that are prey to corrupt elites. And when all institutions are corrupt, you have little to do other than destroy them. So no wonder in 2016, a candidate shows up, Mr. Bolsonaro, who promised to burn it all down. He actually said his slogan was, "Eu não vim para construir, eu vim para destruir." I did not come to build, I came to destroy. We'll first burn it all down and then rebuild it at some future date. And this man won the vote in the 2018 elections. Now, the people who he won a clean election, a competitive election with a very clear majority. There were members of that coalition that were on the extreme right, but there were millions and millions of Brazilians that the prior election had voted on the left. They'd elected President Dilma Rousseff, and that in the previous election had voted for Lula. These are not ideological voters, the majority of them, although Bolsonaro has a small base, which pollsters assume has around 20% of the vote. The majority of voters were voting in anger. Understandable anger, given the severity of the revelations of this massive corruption scandal. Now, very early on, the corruption scandal itself became mired in controversy, because then we found out that the judge and some of the prosecutors in charge of pursuing this thing were themselves in cahoots, and they were trying to prevent former President Lula from being able to run in the 2018 elections. And they managed to get Lula out of the way, send Lula to prison, and that opened the door to Bolsonaro. And then the minute Bolsonaro wins the election, he invites the judge who was in charge of finding out about this corruption scandal to become his Minister of Justice, and this man accepts. That moment, any claim to legitimacy in the investigation goes down the drain. So now you have a society that is deeply divided as to whether the corruption existed. Did it exist? Did it not exist? Was it politically motivated from day one, or was it not politically motivated from day one? Trust in institutions collapsed, and not just trust in institutions. Brazil always had very low trust in institutions. Understandably, right? This is the last country on earth after Egypt to ban slavery. So it's comprehensible. People don't believe in institutions. But then something happened which was not the case before, that interpersonal trust collapsed. According to the World Bank, Brazil, of all countries in the world, has the lowest rate of interpersonal trust. This means that over 90% of Brazilians, when asked, "Can you trust your neighbor?" will say no. This has terrible effects for the quality of any political system. That's the context in which we have the 2022 elections. That's the context in which Bolsonaro claims from the very early days that he does not believe in the electoral results. Remember, Bolsonaro didn't say that in 2022. He claimed the election had been stolen in 2018 when he won. His argument was, I won by a bigger majority. I won on the first round of the election, not the second. The electoral system is crooked. Like every other institution in the land, the electoral court is itself corrupted. And 40% of Brazilians today believe the election was stolen. So Anthony's question is, what are Lula's challenges? This is the context in which Lula arrived. Now, let me tell you a couple of things about the immediate challenges. The biggest challenges, I think, are to do with the state of the economy. The Brazilian economy has been stagnant for 5 years after almost a decade of recession. Poverty has gone up, hunger has reappeared, income redistribution has worsened, and Brazil's rate of debt to GDP is 83%. There's only one other country that has that ratio, and that's India. But India is growing at 6-7% a year. Brazil is not growing at 1%. So this time around, Lula will have a very hard time trying to replicate what he did 20 years ago when he first came to power, which was be everything to everyone, be good to the rich and be good to the poor. There was a lot of money in the kitty to distribute. Now, he doesn't have that money to distribute. Now he will have to manage scarcity, which means some social groups who have representation in Congress will lose. And that's my chief concern now. How am I doing for time?
You've got about 5, 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first set of challenges is to do with that. There's a second set of challenges, which is what do you do now to restore public services? After many years of, how shall I put it? If you speak to an anti-Bolsonaro person, they will tell you Bolsonaro destroyed public policies. If you look at it objectively, you will conclude Bolsonaro destroyed public service. I hope I'm not being overly biased. Let me give you one example on climate change. Brazil is one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world, and that emission is to do mostly with burning forest in the Amazon region and with cattle ranching in the middle of Brazil, in what we call the agricultural frontier, right? Before Bolsonaro took office, Brazil had worsened its deforestation situation for about 4 years. But before that, Brazil had improved its standing for about 10 years. Brazil was managing to curb, slowly but surely, carbon emissions. And then just before Bolsonaro, under Dilma, carbon emissions begin to pop up once again. But the general trend is a declining one. Then Bolsonaro comes, and carbon emissions explode, and they begin to go up and up very dramatically. So now there's a new administration, a new minister for the environment, and the new minister of the environment arrives, and she announces last week that they found out that in the Amazon, where the burning is mostly done by illegal economic activity, they found out there are several illegal, clandestine airstrips that need to be bombed from the air. They found out that there's 1,700 illegal airstrips in the Amazon region. That's the cost of destroying public policy. Now, will Lula be able to bomb all these airstrips and ensure that after you bomb them, they don't get redone within a week? Look at the map. The Amazon is bigger than Western Europe. So even if Brazil has a lot of state capacity, it's a relatively powerful state apparatus, and it has, it's one of the developing countries that has the ability to tax income relatively well, and there's money in the kitty to do lots of public policies. This is an enormous challenge, because not only do they need to bomb the airstrips, ensure they don't get back, provide protections for local communities, but the minute interest groups that benefit from the airstrips are hurt, these guys are going to mobilize their representatives in Congress. And Lula depends on those congressmen in order to pass legislation. So Brazil has an addiction to bad governance, which is very difficult to break, given the institutional design that creates incentives not only for the president and for the members of parliament, but also for special interests that know how to fight their battles. So given the question, will Lula be able to curb carbon emissions, for example, I would say everything that's low-hanging fruit, yes. Everything that's tougher to do, I'm really skeptical. So those are the challenges the Lula administration faces now. Sorry.
Thank you, Matias. Very, very compelling. Compelling in a somber way. Now we'd like to turn to Angela Alonso, who's there in Sao Paulo on Zoom, I assume. Angela, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Can you
Were
hear
able to
me?
hear Matias? Yes, we can hear you
Yes,
fine.
yes. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
So I'd like to thank Anthony Pereira for this invitation to be here today with you, and to Lindsay for smoothing my participation. And it's a pleasure to be here with Matias and Sergio Fausto. I'll talk more about the relations between the government and social movements, and I'd like to share with you some photos, just photos, I promise you. So let's see here if you can see them. Can you?
Not yet.
No?
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Great. So I'd like to start by showing you two photos that appear in the newspapers around the globe in the last days. The place is the same, the Brazilian presidential palace in Brasilia. The meaning is the opposite. The first shows Lula taking office. Bolsonaro's decision to be absent opened space to a symbolic representation of inclusiveness. Lula steps in the palace side by side with members of social movements representing the ones scolded by Bolsonaro's administration: workers, women, Afro-Brazilians, indigenous community, people with physical disabilities or neurodivergence. It was a powerful image of a democratic and inclusive nation. 1 week later, a second photo showed another nation, the self-defined patriotic movement, wearing the national colors, broke into the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and the Congress. They prayed for God, destroyed works of art and historical objects, and even defecated in symbols of democracy. They represent a religious, nationalist, and violent nation. These two scenes give you an idea of the political but also moral conflicts going on in Brazil, and the social movements Lula will have to face in his third term. A hint on how Lula will deal with them from now on can be found in the way he himself and his party dealt with these two sides of the street politics in the past governments. Lula's election in 2003 started the first left-wing government since the 1964 coup. He promised many reforms and attempted to bring them. However, these attempts opened 3 zones of political conflict that would last long. One was around the redistribution of resources. Lula's social policies to reduce inequalities and the opening of social opportunities led to reactions. Liberal movements arose against the redistribution, taxes, and social policies. On the other side, redistributive movements accused the government of compromising with the capital. Another zone of conflict was around the legitimacy of state violence. The government proposed a plebiscite on the right of carrying guns and a national truth commission to deal with the dictatorship political crimes. Human rights movement supported both actions, but movements for the right of self-defense and in defense of the dictatorship arose. They won the plebiscite and stopped the National Truth Commission. The third zone of conflict was around morality. On the public morality side, movements shouted for the moralization of politics after the government was accused of corruption. On the private morality, Lula failed to have the abortion approved, besides the support of feminist and LGBT movements, because of the opposition of religious movements that was to have. So Lula 1 and 2 opened conflict zones that led social movements to organize around redistribution, morality, and violence, and not all in the same direction. For the redistributive movements and the ones organized around sexuality rights, PT hasn't changed the country as much as required. To the anti-redistributive, pro-family, pro-guns movements, it has changed too much. So demonstrations from both sides related to all three zones of conflict started in the streets. Very small protests, for sure. What carried more people to the streets at that point was the private morality, movements for and against sexual rights. The major demonstrations at Lula 1 and 2 were the March for Family for Life, the LGBT parade, and the March for Jesus. Lula 1 and Lula 2 avoided huge protests by stepping back when reactions to proposed reforms blew up. He gave up the reforms in the moral, the abortion, and the violence, the Truth Commission. But he insisted on redistribution and succeeded, closing his second term approved by 87% of the Brazilians. However, the three conflict zones remained open, with social movements disputing them. So Dilma Rousseff took office with those zones of conflict alive. At this point, two main events affected two of them. One was her own enforcement of the National Truth Commission. The act burst movements in defense of the military regime. The other event was due to the Supreme Court, who fed the conflicts around morality by approving the same-sex marriage and by broadcasting the corruption trial, the Mensalão. Those events motivated the movements around morality and the ones around violence to protest. Summing up the others around redistribution, Dilma Rousseff faced 3 cycles of protest. In June 2013, all movements on the left and on the right sides of the government demonstrated at the same time, reacting to the PT's policies by different reasons. In 2015, the right-wing movements demonstrated alone, focusing on public morality. They call themselves patriotic movements reliant on the national flag. In 2016, the patriots came back to the streets asking for impeachment. A left-wing movement alliance reacted on the left of the government on Rousseff's behalf. These 3 cycles of protest showed how big the right-wing movement's field was. However, it is important to notice that this patriotic field was not a new right. It was not new since it has been organizing itself since Lula won. Neither was it a single movement, but a network of disparate movements. They allied because they had in common a shared enemy, the PT's policy and morality, redistribution and violence, and a shared diagnosis. The country's most important issue was not redistribution, but corruption. The corruption frame was key to put unlike movements together, since the word corruption implied both the state corruption and the moral corruption. During the parliamentary vote on the Rousseff's impeachment, the corruption frame dominated the discourse. References to God, family, and public robbery pop up. Violence also appeared when Bolsonaro defended a lead figure of the dictatorship torture mechanism. During Temer ruling years after the impeachment, although frequent left-wing street demonstrations were small, by its side, the patriotic field grew walking into the political system. In the 2018 election, many movement leaders became representatives and supported Bolsonaro's candidacy for the presidency. Part of the patriotic field did it as a strategic action to prevent PT to come back to office. However, some of them sincerely aligned with Bolsonaro's position in morality, redistribution, and violence. As a candidate and as a president, Bolsonaro succeeded in collapsing all 3 zones of conflict in a single one, the morality. He framed all political conflicts as a single moral fight, as the good against the evil. In the redistribution, he revived the ghost of a communist revolution as a threat to the property rights. In the violence, he stimulated the gun property for good citizens to defend themselves from the bad guys. And in the morality, he never distinguished between public and private, and displayed himself as the caretaker of tradition, family, and religion against the immoralists. He found hard supporters among the authoritarian movements. However, he also counted on the liberal and conservative movements. And at the last year votes, as the last year vote showed, he also counted on almost half of the country as well. Because of that, it's hard to say whether his government did not face huge protests thanks to the pandemic, or because the left-wing movements were incapable of mobilizing a multitude against him. So Lula won the election, but this is far from good enough in all areas. In the street politics, Lula III will find out a situation unlike the one he faced in his 2 first terms in 3 senses. First, although he took office, as we see in my first slide, supported by identitarian, redistributive, and human rights movements, those are the ones that first supported and then abandoned PT in the past. when the government had to drop some reforms in order to govern. As Lula will have to give up some reforms again, possibly the abortion, for the same reasons, probably the retreats will bring left-wing movements back to the street. Second, in Lula's first term, the patriotic field was under organization. Now, many liberal, conservative, and authoritarian movements are organized, nationally spread, internationally connected, financed, and part of them armed. Although not all of them praised the palace invaders, they are ready to join street demonstrations against the government. The authoritarian slice is the point of a potential huge oppositionist street iceberg. Third and last, the political violence was out of fashion in Brazil since redemocratization to 2013 protests, when the left-wing movements brought it back using the black bloc tactic. Nowadays, are the authoritarian movements the ones using violence as a way of politics? First accepted by the left and now used by the right, political violence is a path hard to break in the streets in the near future. Consider all of this. This is probable that the government will face demonstrations from the left and from the right, and uses of political violence in the streets. In this way, Lula 3 can be closer to Dilma 1 and 2 than to his own first governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. That's plenty to think about. Lula as Dilma 1 and 2, not Lula 1 and 2. Sergio, we'd now like to turn to you. Sergio, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Well, wonderful to listen to my two colleagues. Thank you so much, Tony, for the invitation. I was delighted to see the overlapping circles that Angela presented. I think Angela beautifully shown conceptually the kind of ideas that I would like to convey in my presentation in a more telegraphic way, and focusing more on the far right movement. The questions that I would like to address, of course, this has to do with the question about what are Lula's challenges, but I will try to angle this from the perspective of Lula's facing a strong opposition, much stronger than the one he has faced it in his two prior terms in office. All right. First observation, I think Brazil is bent to the right. It was clearly bent to the right in 2018. Again, in spite of Lula's victory, it's still bent to the right. What I mean by that, I mean that the idea behind that is that there is a tripod of key ideas that are prevalent in Brazilian society. One is moral conservatism that has to do with abortion, gender, so-called gender ideology, and very associated with religious values. The other is punitivism, mano dura, uno diría en español, when it comes to deal with criminality. And the third idea, which I think it's important, is individual and family-centered view of society and social mobility. The basic idea is that individual efforts and family solidarities are what matters. a strong rejection of politics, skepticism towards governments. These are ideas that are entrenched in Brazilian society, and they have come to stay. I mean, they have a long history, but they gained strength in the last 10 years or so. What the far right does, and this is new, is radicalize each one of these preferences and proclivities and articulate them in a paranoid worldview. So moral conservatism is transformed into a moral crusade. Punitivism is translated into firearms for all good citizens to fight the bad ones. And this individual and family-centered view of society and social mobility is conflated with a sort of old school, very pedestrian anti-communism, blown out of proportion, as if Brazil was on the edge or is in the edge of becoming Venezuela or Cuba, which is obviously preposterous. The far right has been defeated. January 8th is a kind of a blast in disguise for those like us who want to de-radicalize the country, but make no mistake, they have roots in society, they're well organized, they are internationally connected, they have money, so it's going to be a tough walking uphill for the Lula's government to face them. Other information that I think which are relevant to understand the context in which Lula will have to govern. All and this are, I mean, I'm trying to foot the basic assertion that Brazil is bent to the right. All governors elected, except for those in the northeastern part of the country, are either center-right or center-wing. 50% of representatives in the House belong to right-wing parties, only 25 to left-wing ones. It's true that parties in Brazil are not programmatic, but clearly it's a Congress inclined to the right. The so-called bullet, Bible, and beef caucuses are the strongest in Congress. Lula has lost in all regions but the Northeast. Lula lost in all income brackets but the bottom of the pyramid, which of course accounts for the greater chunk of the electorate. 50% of the population, as Matias highlighted, are made of poor people. So there is this entrenched anti-PT sentiment in a very polarized society. Lula's victory does not change that, at least not overnight. What I think it's feasible, and this is a challenge, it's to strongly increase the costs of joining and supporting the far right in order to isolate it. And to overcome this challenge, Matias is right to say that the two main challenges is to manage the economy in a sound way and to rein in deforestation in the Amazon region, because this is the key factor for attracting investment to Brazil and to reproject Brazil in the world system. Let me now try to focus on the main pillars that support the Bolsonaro's movement and the far right in Brazil. My point here is to show that they are strong pillars, stronger in terms of size, in terms of organization, in terms of its capacity to act in a coordinated way. First pillar, the military. And this is important to underscore. because this is one key difference between the social base of the far right in Brazil when compared to the United States. When I refer to the military, I'm adding up two categories here. The armed forces, which accounts for 350,000 members, which pass 350,000 members, not including retired personnel. If you include retired personnel, you have to double this number. But it also includes the military police. The military police are state-based security forces with 400,000 members in the rank and file. If you include the retired personnel, you're talking about 800,000. So if you take into consideration the two categories, we are talking about 1.5 million people, among whose the support to Bolsonaro has ranged from 60 to 70%, way above the national average. The thing here is not only the sheer numbers, but the thing that the military, including the military police, has a widespread presence throughout the country. Especially the military is a closely knit community. We refer to them as the military family. So you have to include, in order to calculate their political and electoral influence, the members of their family. So this is a very strong pillar in which the Bolsonaro's movement has penetrated deeply. What are the signs? What are the evidence that we have that show that Bolsonarismo, as we call it, has penetrated in the military? Some data for you to think about. Surveys conducted by the National Forum on Public Safety, most of them published in 2021, show that the active participation of retired military officers and family members in right social media groups, this participation was very, very significant. 48% of military police personnel participated in right-wing groups, 27% in radical right-wing groups. The reasons why they have embraced the Bolsonaro's movement, some of them have already been mentioned by Angela. I just want to add one thing to the sort of to the factors related to the dictatorship, the Truth Commission. We can elaborate a little bit more on that. Strong antagonism against human rights, NGOs, and activists in the context of police high lethality rates. Bolsonaro has always advocated a legal protection to police officers against lawsuits. And this has brought about a strong support, strong identification between him and the rank and file of the military police. This is not going away anytime soon. In the armed forces, in the military police, the support has consolidated, has crystallized through co-optation. Just one piece of information. The number of appointed military officials to civilian positions have more than tripled during Bolsonaro's administration. Second pillar, evangelical groups. And now you in the US can relate to that. Around 30% of the Brazilian population now is affiliated to evangelical church. This is a more than a 5 times increase in 13 years and growing. There is a religious transition in Brazil. Evangelicals are set to become the majority in 10 years' time. This is a demographic factor that in principle bodes well to the right. And a big challenge of Lula's government is regain territory among the evangelicals, tall order. They're very active religiously and politically speaking. They have a grassroots movements plus juggernaut of TV, radios, extremely strong communication power, so to speak, that translates into itself into electoral power. A caucus of about 180 members in the lower house with virtual veto power on all moral issues. First and foremost, Angela, abortion rights. This is clearly a third rail for any government in Brazil. Third pillar, and Anthony, let me know when I'm 5 minutes away from the end of my presentation. Is that all right?
Yeah, you are now.
Okay, let me speed up this thing here. Third pillar, very important, the agribusiness. The agribusiness accounts now for roughly 25–30% of Brazilian GDP. 4 times increase in 50 years and growing. The agribusiness conquered all the Center-West region with ramifications. Has grown above the national GDP steadily over the years. Has conquered new frontiers where new cities have been built. A new self-confident mentality, a cowboy culture has emerged. Far from the coast, power, proud of the hinterland. So the Brazilians, rednecks, if you want to say that in the American lexicon, extremely organized, extremely powerful in Congress, with a caucus of about 280 members, which accounts for more than half of the House and the Senate. What are the factors that have led them to embrace Bolsonaro so strongly? Economic liberalism of sorts, the idea that they're self-made men, that the state has always been a hindrance to their efforts, that the lesser the state intrudes in economic activities, the better. Fear of the landless labor movement, MST, fear of criminal activity, which has increased in rural areas. This is connected to the strong advocacy to the freedom to bear arms, Second Amendment, and a strong conflict with indigenous people because of land demarcation. Points of attention, looking to the future. Let me take one step back. January 8th was a kind of bless in disguise for Lula, because it creates the opportunity to insert an edge between the normal right and the far right, increasing the costs of the normal right to adhere, to support, and to be towed away by the extreme right. But it's still wide open, right? Things that we don't know, and I'll leave it there. How January 8th will play out judicially and politically speaking, right? We know that on the part of the new administration, there is strong political will to punish military and civilians involved in the staged attempt coup d'etat January 8th. On the part of Supreme Court, same thing. But we still don't know what will be the end of this story in terms of punishments and its political impact. War of narratives, right? Now the press is on government side, democracy above all, right? But the far right still has a well-financed right-wing network. International pressure and collaboration matters. This is a plus on the Democratic side. It was very important to count on the support of the US administration, Europe, in recognizing, just like that, in matter of seconds, the electoral outcome in Brazil. One last word about the risks in this battle against the far right. The risk of overreach, right? The risk that in equipping democracy to fight the far right, the idea of a militant democracy that can encroach on freedom of organization, freedom of expression. This will be a very contentious issue in Brazil in the foreseeable future. I think we have enough food for thought, and I'll leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sergio. Thanks to all three of the panelists for very rich analyses of the challenges of the government. As I was listening, I was trying to convert the analytical points into sort of an action plan for the government. By the end, I decided that people should just discreetly resign and not try to confront these problems. But I'm not sure if there's anyone from the government listening. But I'm sure a lot of you have questions. And what I hope we could do is take a round of questions for one or more of the panelists, take several at a time, and then give them back for the panelists. And I have to ask you to be, we've only got about a half an hour left, but I want to open it up to the people in the room for any questions or comments that you might have. Yes, right here. Yeah.
I didn't hear anything from the three speakers about effects of the model administration.
We can't hear the answers, the
Yeah, they got to
questions
hear
from
on the Zoom. Sorry.
Me neither.
I got to turn it on.
I didn't hear anything regarding the effect of the Trump administration, which took power in 2017, and that was serving as a model for Bolsonaro. I wondered what will be the effect should the Republican Party take power again here in 2024? And do you think there's a direct personal connection between the far right in Brazil and the Trumpists and the far right in the United States?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's another question over here. Yeah. We'll try to get to all of you. Yeah.
Hi, and thanks again for your presentation. It was very interesting. Should we expect more movements such as the 8th of January, or shall we expect instead a comeback to classic forms of demonstration?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. We'll get to you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask a little bit, considering Lula's previous presidencies, he was able to have a lot of good political power thanks to good economics. So I wanted to ask, what do you think will be the relationship between the political challenges and the economic challenges, I'm sorry, especially considering changing relationships with the US and also China, which I think was very important for Lula's previous presidency.
Thanks. Okay. Over there.
Hello, boa tarde. I just wanted to ask about basically the relation between this new Lula government and Venezuela. You know, the U.S. approach to Venezuela, especially with the situation of, you know, the supply chain with, you know, that's affected by the Ukraine war and all the confluence of all those factors. if the U.S. is changing its relation with the Venezuelan government, would Lula take the same approach as it did with the Chavez Maduro government as in its previous terms?
Yes, thank you so much. What is the forecast for far-right movements in Brazil intensifying or appeasing after 4 years of Lula's government? And is there already a clear forecast of Western religious extremism posing revolutionary movements that stray away from democracy? And will Brazil be our first successful attempt of such?
Thanks. I wanted to ask, similar to the first question, it's hard. I appreciate Matias's point that trust in institutions was falling before Bolsonaro was elected, and Sergio and Angela sort of laid out very clearly that there are very particularly Brazilian conditions and contingencies that led to Bolsonaro, but it's hard also not to interpret the rise of Bolsonaro in the context of global populism, including Johnson in England, including Erdogan in Turkey, including Orban in Hungary, including Kaczynski in Poland, including Duterte in Philippines. It all kind of happened right around the same time. And so I'm wondering if the panelists could remark on global populism and the way that that also poses a challenge for Lula.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm trying to be as concise as possible here. And I'm going to be quite honest. Everything, I know the title of this panel was Challenges of the Lula Government, but I'm leaving with this a little depressed. And I just kind of want to ask, I mean, I was going back and forth over a text with someone that I have watching this online. And although this is very divided in Brazil, looking back at the first round of elections, Lula did receive some of the most votes for any candidate in that round. We saw like about a 5% margin. So to kind of change the mood, what is something positive that we can take from the Lula administration going forward? Is there anything to look forward there?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to the almost like a ground zero, as you can call it, that we saw in Brazil from the last 5 to 6 years, I would say, do you think that this, as a whole, not just as we've seen as an example with the far right and the left in Brazil, but as a whole in Latin America as well, there seems to be a resurgence of the far right in relation to the pink movement, I would say, is going around with Colombia, Chile. How would you guys respond as like an example with Brazil to the ongoing far right movements, not only in Brazil itself, but Latin America and even the United States as a whole itself?
Lula and the PT came to prominence based on the on the labor movement. I'm wondering maybe this is one possibility for optimism. Can the trade union movement revitalize itself with the support of Lula? And what's the situation of the trade unions now?
This would make it 10, so there's a lot for you to. That be potentially more negative than positive. So thank you for all the questions. If I can try to limit you to 5 minutes roughly, Matias, I know that's condensing you to a sort of tweet for each question. And take them as you will. But yeah, we've only got a little bit more than 5 minutes each for you guys to respond. Sorry.
Great. These are wonderful questions on top of two wonderful presentations by Angela and Sergio. So let me try and react. Let me start with what's positive. The positive thing is that democracy did not collapse. And it was possible to form a pro-democracy coalition that delivered the majority of the votes. I think that is a win for a political system that has been so poor at delivering decent social services for its people. So I think that's positive. The challenges are enormous, but Brazil remains more or less stable. there is a, by and large, free press. Elections are competitive, they're clean, and like what Bolsonaro suggests, the electoral system works and delivers the vote quickly and electronic. All these are positives in spite of the massive challenges that we have. Does Trump have an effect on Bolsonaro? Absolutely. I think Bolsonaro would have not existed without a model. Bolsonaro copied Trump's playbook from day one, and he's still copying it now. Now, the question, does Trump pay any attention to Bolsonaro? I don't know about that. Bolsonaro is in Florida now. He's certainly trying. I don't know what attention there is, but as both Angela and Sergio pointed out before, the connections between Brazil's far right and the far right in particular in the United States, but also in Europe, are extensive. And this is, as someone suggested, a global movement. I think it's very hard to understand Bolsonarismo outside that global wave of populism on the right. Remember, Latin America was famous for global waves of populism on the left, but now it's clearly on the right. To Tony's question about should Lula revisit civil-military relationships, I think there's very little doubt that what we see now is the product of Brazil being one of the only post-dictatorial regimes in South America that did not have truth and justice. But should Lula go in that direction now? I think the answer is he cannot afford to do it. I think he's too weak to do it now because although he won the election, he won it by a very slim margin. And as we were saying, the economy is not looking good, which leads me to the question about economic relations. I can't remember who asked it, but what's the situation? Well, both the IMF and the World Bank say the global economy is going to tank. We're heading towards a recession. This recession includes China, which is now Brazil's biggest export market. So if we look at the global economy, things for Brazil are not looking very pretty, even if commodities are what they are. I think it was Sergio who made a wonderful point about the demographic transition and the economic transition Brazil has been undergoing, reprimarización of the Brazilian economy. And this has terrible consequences when the global economy tanks, right? As we know. Finally, on the regional trend, someone asked about, is what we are seeing now a regional resurgence of the far right, a backlash against the pink tide a few years ago? There might be an awful lot of that going on. The one thing to attend to, however, I think is this. Now, in South America, most countries are governed by the left, with the exception, the notable exception in the southern cone of Uruguay. Countries are moving to the left. Will they be able to translate this into a cohesive regional formation? I'm not sure. The last time around, when we had the pink tide, remember, Lula tried. UNASUR was about that. Expanding Mercosur was about that. Are we going to see that now? I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see it. And I will end with the issue of Venezuela. Lula has said already he's reopening the Brazilian embassy in Caracas, which had been shut. He's introduced a bill to try and allow Maduro to come into Brazil. Maduro couldn't. He could have taken to prison, under custody rather than prison, if he were to step into Brazil. That's why Maduro couldn't attend Lula's inauguration. But the context of this is that the United States is reopening dialogue with Maduro and coming out, providing a way out for Maduro. So Lula is going to jump on that bandwagon. I don't think Lula is going to take the initiative in any detectable way. Lula is coming to Washington on the 10th of February, and he will talk the talk that Lula does, and he's wonderful doing that talk. But I don't think we're going to see Brazil performing the foreign policy ambitions or replaying the ambitions that we saw in the first two Lula administrations, where Brazil was growing at 4%, 5%, and 6% a year.
Thank you, Matias. Angela, before I turn to you, I just wanted to throw a few questions into the mix that came from our listeners on Zoom. So there's one question here that says, is the extreme right a product of an infatuation with the US by middle and upper class Brazilians? There's also one about this trip to Washington by Lula on the 10th of February. What sort of stance will Lula have in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean? Somebody asked, why, with so many of the military supporting the far right, how worried are you about a military coup? And which difficulties will Lula encounter while dealing with the middle class in Brazil, taking into consideration its ideological shift to the right, and this, the fact that there's a hard right that seems to be golpista or interested in the coup. I know there's a lot there added to what we already had, which was 10 questions. So Angela, it's up to you how to slalom through these various questions, but I turn to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful questions, but many of them. So I'll try to answer some. I will start with this global conservative wave. Of course, there is a connection between those movements. Bolsonaro, one of Bolsonaro's sons, is member of the Conservative Action. This is an international group. So they have been in connection with US right movements, but also internationally. So it's, and not just them, not just Bolsonaro and his sons, but many of the conservative movements in Brazil and the liberal movements as well has been connected to the US, and some of them with the Students for Liberty since 1 decade ago. So we have a strong connection. It's not just a model, it's a kind of transmission of a style of politics, a transmission of money and influence. So I see that it's not just that Trump is the model, but we have an organization that can go on without Trump and without Bolsonaro, because you have connections between movements in both countries. And as for the far right in Latin America but also in US, I think for both those Latin America and US and even Europe, the internet facilitated greatly those connections. So now we have connections between leaders that travel as in the past, but we also have connections between, let's say, common people that are not internationalized in that sense of traveling abroad, but that are able to reach their counterpart in other countries and emulated models of action. So we can talk about a kind of grassroots right now that is internationally connected. Why populism is global? I don't like this term populism, frankly, because I think that every time we see someone that's popular and is not on our side, we say, well, they are populist. In democracy, everybody has to address the people. But I understand that those leaders that talk to the people in the lower part of the society have been doing well in politics after the new liberal politics around the world. So when we have a welfare in working well in Europe and partly in other parts of the world, we don't have so much things like that going on. So I think there is a material reason for that. People are not living very well, and the usual politics are not giving the right answer to those problems. As for the violence and the religious extremism, I think we are gonna see violent protests in the next years, and not just in Brazil. I think violence came back to the politics, to the street politics, in a way that's similar to the one that we have in the 70s, when you have those groups working more on the left. But now I think we have the right, very organized, to use violence, since they have this ideology of being with guns all the time to self-protection. And so I'm very pessimist about that. I think unless we control the guns in Brazil and in US and every place, we are going to keep that happening. Quickly, the trade union, I think that is a very good question, because Lula came from a trade union, and he certainly will try to do something about that. But besides just things that he can do, as for instance, direct money for them, there is a kind of generational gap between the trade leaders and the new generation of activists. I don't see them being very compelling to the new generations, especially on the left. And as about middle class, well, middle class is conservative. It goes without saying. And in Brazil, I think PT was wrong when expected to raise people to middle class and to have them supporting the left agenda, especially on moral issues. Oh, I'll leave here, because I could say a lot. Thank you.
My turn, I guess. So very interesting questions. I'll try to answer them as comprehensively as I can. I mean, it has already been said that Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo are part of a larger phenomenon, which is global. Let me just emphasize what is distinctive about the Brazilian experience. And I think the military component, especially when we're comparing with the US, it is very important. The idea that the military have a sort of right of tutelage over civilians is deep-seated in Brazilian history, right? This has not been entirely overcome in the last decades. I think one of our mistakes was to believe that that was a settled question. It was not. The military has passively accepted to go back to the barracks under civilian rule, but they have not internalized democratic values. And in the wake of the Lava Jato, the car wash investigation, in the wake of the Truth Commission, they feel it was time to regain protagonism, both because they thought there was a threat looming large. So Argentina and Brazil, we're gonna be criminalized, so we have to react. And on the other hand, the Lava Jato investigation and the collapse of the political system reinforce the idea that civilians are corrupt, and that the military are not only less corrupt, but more competent to deal with national issues. They are the true patriots. So they felt that temptation, they step up. This is still a pending thorny issue in Brazil. One good question Lula was brave enough to change the head of the army after January 8. And the general who has taken office is what we call here un legalista, no? Strong commitment to the democratic institutions. He's obviously walking on preacher's ground, but he's the right man in the right place, and this is good news. With respect to the likelihood of new insurgency movements, hard to say. I think I tend to agree with Angela that the far right movement is strong. I think it has some level of coordination, of course, but some level of spontaneity. There's not a central command that can control. So you either arrest the central committee or you talk to them and you have control over this far right movements. This is we are in the new brave new world. This is not the way it works. But I once again look at the military. I think we have to pay attention on how this unfolds within the military, because what was the rationale behind the insurgents in January 8 was to play havoc in order to justify a military intervention, right? And I think if the military issue is somewhat sorted out in a positive way, the likelihood of new insurgencies with a systemic impact will go down. Let me focus on a third actor, which I think it's of key importance in the political scenario, is the low middle class. The poor accounts for 50% of the electorate. The low middle class account for 36% of the electorate. This is enough to understand how important it is to address not only the poor, but also the low middle class. Lula has been defeated in the low middle class with, according to the polls, right before the election by a margin of 10%. There is a strong sense of entrepreneurship in the low middle class. Lots of them work in the informal sector, right? So you need the government needs to have a message to them, not only to the trade unions, not only to the workers in the formal sector, because the formal sector, in particularly the industrial sector, has shrunk over the years. So it's more important in the political dynamics, the low middle class, the informal workers, the workers linked to the gig economy. What kind of labor protection can you give to them in order to protect them on the one hand, but not to stifle the dynamism of this sector on the other hand? The government has to come up with new ideas to address these issues. On the positive side, once again, it's hard to exaggerate that, given the circumstances, given the strength of conservative forces in anti-democratic forces in Brazil, that Lula won, that we have in place a strong alliance between politicians, judges, the press, activists, in order to defend democracy. But clearly, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? Democracy is not the only game in town. There are people who think that democracy is at best dispensable.
Thank you, Sergio. You all three of your panelists, you're helping me think about what's going to be commented on quite soon, which is the first 100 days of this administration, right? We're going to, in the first half of April, there's going to be a lot of commentary about how did this government do in the first 100 days? And my thinking after listening to you is that Dilma won if they achieve the standards of Gilma 1 in 2011, that would be pretty good. And in fact, it may not be that good. But I wanted to thank all the panelists, you here in the room with your excellent questions, the people on Zoom. I hope you got a sense of the thinking of the panelists on the questions that you raised. And stay tuned to the PROBRAS, the Brazil program, because we'll have other events, right? We'll have an event in March. Simone is there from our Sustainable Development pillar of PROBRAS. So I hope to see some of you again at the next event, which I don't think we have the date yet. Do we, Simone? Okay, around 20. Okay, that's another thing I wanted to tell you too. If you're interested in events on Brazil, sign up on the listserv. You can find us on the web pages of the LAC, the Latin American Caribbean Center, and then you can get announcements about other things going on. So I hope to see some of you at the next event around the 22nd or 23rd of March. So thanks very much.